Hi everyone, and welcome back to Crafters Grove. It's been quite a long break since we've last seen you all, and that's because we have been taking care of our little ones. So it's been over a year and a half since we've last posted a video, and some of you were wondering where we've been, so that's where we've been. For today's video, we are going to be showing you how to widen the neck hole of a baby sweater. This would of course work for any size sweater. In this case, we're taking advantage of the seams at the back of the sweater here to do a pretty seamless, pardon the pun, widening of the opening of the sweater. So what you'll need for this project is 2 threads, one that matches your sweater color and one that matches the color of your fasteners, which is a hair elastic, and buttons, which are the other 2 things you'll need for this project. For the fasteners, I'm choosing to go with black because it continues with that design that's created at the front of the sweater with the black contrasting ears and face. So now it's time to choose our buttons. If you're anything like me, anytime a shirt comes with an extra button, you stick it in a jar. This is excellent if you're going to be doing repair projects later on or projects like this. So go into your jar of buttons and select what you think will look best with your sweater. So to make the neck hole bigger, we need to cut into the fabric. There's no way about it. Taking advantage of the seams that are already there in the fabric is going to not only save you time in sewing later, it's also going to mean a more reinforced cut because there's already threads sewn into the fabric there. So you can see here on the back of the sweater, there are these vertical seams. Let's take a closer look at these before we make any cuts. So you can see there is a fold over of fabric. What we want to do is cut on the opposite side of the fabric so that we're not cutting into that nicely folded over part, which is again going to add more reinforcement to the overall piece. Make sure to take your time with the sweater and every so often stop as you go along and check the neck hole size so that you don't end up cutting more than you need. So now we're going to use the sewing machine to reinforce the edges that we cut into the sweater. Because the fabric on the neckband is really thin and it doesn't have that reinforcement as the rest of the seam does, we have to be extra careful when sewing. So what I did was I placed the needle of the sewing machine in the middle of the neckband and then did a reverse stitch to the edging and then continued forward with the rest of my stitching. Some hand stitching might actually prove to be a little bit more delicate for this delicate situation because you see I did end up with a little bit of fraying at the end, which I'm trimming off now. During this stage of the project, you want to pick a thread color that matches your sweater color so that the stitching is hidden from view. Next, repeat this on the other side of the cut of the neckband. Next, we want to reinforce the fabric where the cut ends because that opening is going to constantly open and close and put tension along that fabric. And if we don't provide some reinforced stitching, eventually that's going to continue to tear over time and the garment won't last. To reinforce this weak point, we're going to go to the base of the cut and sew 2 small lines fairly close together, perpendicular to the cut. So let's zoom in and you can actually see that first stitch line complete here. Now we'll sew that second line to add some more reinforcement. So you'll notice we're kind of doing some back and forth right now, and the reason why we're going in what might seem like an out of order is because we want to reinforce the weakest points before we continue with more sewing. So in terms of this piece, the neckband was the weakest point, so we reinforced those edges first. Then we went to the base of the cut because as we sew more, we're going to be pulling on that cut. So that's the next place to reinforce. And then we can finish with reinforcing our seams a second time, as you see me doing here. And what that involves is just going over the entire cut line, just to the left, in this case, of the original sew lines, to provide a second row of reinforced sewing. So I just want to explain this in a little bit more detail because I don't know that it was that clear at the beginning of the video. So because we are fortunate enough to cut into a pre-existing seam, we already had quite a lot of reinforcement already there. So the left side, or now the top side, already had one row of stitching already there, so we only had to add an additional row to reinforce that edge. And then the bottom that you see here already had 2 rows of stitching, so we didn't have to reinforce that edge any further. That is, other than the little bit of neckband that had no stitching. Okay, so it's time to attach our fasteners, so get out those buttons and that hair elastic. And what you're going to do is wrap the hair elastic into a loop to get a sense of how big of a loop you need to create in order to wrap the hair elastic around the button to fasten one side of the sweater to the other side of the sweater. So how you're going to do that is make a loop out of the elastic and literally push the button through. Once you have a comfortable size to easily push that button through, hold your thumb at the base there. And then you want to add about 7 millimeters to the length of that loop so that if you cut the elastic and pulled it out straight, it would be a total of 14 millimeters. That will just allow you to have enough room to fasten the loop onto the sweater with a couple rows of stitching. So once you have the length, you can cut it. Right after cutting, you want to make sure you seal the ends of the elastics with a flame, like a lighter or a match, so that the parts don't separate from themselves. In terms of placement of your fasteners, you want to make sure that the first fastener is right at the top in the neckband so that the sweater does attach together once the fasteners have been closed. And then the remaining fasteners can be spaced out equally within the remaining section of the cut. To secure the loops to the sweater, I used a sewing machine to sew 2 lines of stitching across the ends of the loop. As you can see, this was rather a tricky process to get everything positioned correctly. So what I found worked best was positioning the sweater first, then placing the loop, before releasing the pressure of the pressure foot to hold the loop in place. I also found at times using a pair of scissors was really helpful to use the edge to reposition the loop underneath the pressure foot. You could of course skip all of these steps by sewing the loops onto the sweater by hand. I'm just not great at sewing by hand, my stitching doesn't come out straight. But I did at the end do a bit of hand stitching just to compensate for some of the missing areas in that first loop because it didn't sew too well in the sewing machine given that the neckband was quite flimsy and then the loop was finicky as well. Once you feel like you have a sturdy connection of your loop to the sweater, give the loop a good tug just to make sure that it is secure, and if it's not, do an extra line of stitching. Overall, I did find the longer the loop, the easier it was to sew onto the sweater, so you may consider leaving an extra bit of room at the end of your loops just to make them a bit easier to sew. Once you're happy with that first loop, move on to the next loops following the same steps as you did in the first one. How many loops you have depends on how big your cut is. The bigger your cut is, the more loops you're going to want to have. For example, I cut an 8 centimeter slit into my sweater, and I found that 3 fasteners was the best to hold that sweater together. As I mentioned, my loops weren't all of the same size, and that's because I had different size buttons. When you're dealing with used buttons or an assortment of buttons, It's quite fine to have different sizes, and you can align those in whatever design that you want. I went in order of size, the smallest being at the top and growing in size as I went towards the bottom of the sweater. You could of course buy new buttons and then they could all be the same size. And you can also mix and match where the different sizes are, and that can look quite fun as well. If the fasteners you've chosen for this project are a different color than your sweater, you do run into a bit of a conundrum when choosing the thread color. If you pick a thread color that matches the sweater, it will show up over the elastics and vice versa. So what I chose was white thread that's going to camouflage into the sweater, but is going to show up on the elastics. So I'll show you at the end of the video what I did to hide that white thread that was appearing over top of the loops. If you've sewn your loop on and you find that the ends aren't quite even, as I found here, don't worry about it, don't stress. Just cut the ends so that they're even, and then use a lighter again to seal the ends. Once you're finished sewing on those loops, don't forget to cut all your loose ends, and then it's time to sew on the buttons. When sewing on the buttons, I like to use the same colored thread that matches the buttons. Again, this helps to camouflage the thread within the work. Of course, if you want the thread to pop, it is quite a fun design to do a contrasting color of thread within the buttons. To determine where you're going to place your buttons, you want to use your loops as a guide. So you want to place the middle of the button about 1 millimeter or 2 away from the edge of the loop. This will put a little bit of tension on the elastic when it's wrapped around the button, which is what you want in order to hold the sweater together. And then height-wise, the middle of the button should line up with the middle of the loop. It's a good idea after finishing each button to try fastening the loop around the button to make sure that the button is in a good location. If you find that one button isn't quite in the right place, it's not too late to take out the stitching and try sewing it in a different location. Okay, so earlier I mentioned that I had a little trick for you on what to do about this white thread over your black hair elastics. Well, if you're using black, you can just get a black Sharpie, or really a Sharpie of whatever color your fasteners are, and color over that thread with the Sharpie. As long as the Sharpie color matches the elastic well enough, you'll have no idea that anything was done at all to alter the stitching. I love using Sharpies for hacks like this. Okay, here you have it, the final product. And I cannot get enough of these fasteners in the contrasting color that match the design at the front of the sweater. Just have fun picking out your fasteners because you're putting a lot of effort into this product and you want to be happy with it in the end. Thanks for watching. We really hope that this project inspires you to fix a garment in your closet and helps bring new life into an otherwise unusable piece of clothing. Take care!